are waiting for them to say, "I was wrong." You are waiting for them to finally acknowledge the wreckage they've left in your life. Stop waiting. Because the moment you demand an apology from someone who is incapable of genuine remorse, you are simply handing them the steering wheel to your mental health all over again. But here is the irony. There is a way to force an apology. It isn't by begging for empathy that will never work. It's by fundamentally changing how you interact with their ego. When you stop providing the reaction they feed on, you change the power dynamic entirely. We are conditioned to believe that if we just explain ourselves clearly enough, if we show them the bruises, they will finally see us. That is a fantasy. When you deal with a narcissist, you aren't dealing with a person who lacks information. You are dealing with a person who lacks the capacity to center anyone other than themselves. To get them to apologize, you have to stop trying to heal them and start managing the environment. The fundamental expectation that a person with a narcissistic personality structure will eventually experience a profound moment of self-reflection and offer a genuine, heartfelt apology is perhaps the most significant trap one can fall into when dealing with such an individual. It is essential to recognize that this is not merely a matter of stubbornness or pride. It is a limitation rooted in the core of their psychological framework. At the heart of this personality style lies a fragile ego that is shielded by an elaborate defense mechanism. Admitting fault, acknowledging a mistake, or expressing genuine remorse requires a level of internal security and ego strength that simply does not exist for the narcissist. To apologize is to admit that they are not the idealized perfect figure they need the world and themselves to believe they are. For them, vulnerability is not a path to connection. It is a terrifying chasm that they will do everything in their power to avoid. When you hold on to the hope for an apology, you are implicitly operating under the assumption that they share your capacity for empathy and self-correction. You believe that if you can just articulate your pain clearly enough or present the facts of their transgression in an undeniable way, they will see the light and feel the weight of their actions. However, this is a profound misunderstanding of their internal reality. The narcissist does not experience your pain. They only experience the frustration that your pain causes them. If they do offer an apology, it is almost never an expression of remorse for the harm done to you. Instead, it is a strategic calculation. It is a social transaction performed to de-escalate a situation that has become inconvenient for them, to clear the path so they can continue to draw attention and validation from you, or to silence your critiques. When you observe a narcissist offering an apology, it is vital to peel back the surface layer and recognize it for what it truly is, a calculated maneuver rather than an expression of contrition. In the complex landscape of narcissistic behavior, the concept of a tactical apology is a cornerstone of their relational strategy. Because they lack the genuine emotional circuitry to process guilt or empathy, they do not apologize to mend a bridge or soothe your hurt. Instead, they use the apology as a tool for maintenance. It is a form of hoovering, a term used to describe the way these individuals attempt to suck their target back into the cycle of interaction once that person begins to pull away or set boundaries. When you start to withdraw your emotional investment or your supply, the narcissist senses the loss of control and the loss of the feedback loop they depend on. The apology, in this context, is essentially a piece of bait. They are not looking to reconcile, they are looking to stabilize the environment so that the flow of attention and validation returns to normal. They may use phrases that sound like responsibility, but if you look closely, you will notice they are often qualified or redirected. They might say, "I'm sorry you feel that way," which shifts the focus onto your reaction rather than their action, or they may offer a generic apology to make the conflict vanish as quickly as possible. This is not meant to foster intimacy, but to neutralize your frustration and keep you from leaving or enforcing a consequence. It is a defensive strategy designed to lower your guard. Once you accept that these apologies are purely tactical, the impact they have on you changes. You stop viewing them as a sign of progress or a promise of change. Instead, you start to see them as evidence that your boundary setting is working. If a narcissist is apologizing to you, it is usually because they have run out of other options to maintain the status quo. It is a sign that they are feeling the pressure of your distance. Understanding this prevents you from falling into the trap of believing that the relationship is suddenly going to improve or that they have finally achieved a breakthrough. By identifying the apology as a maneuver, you maintain your psychological detachment, ensuring that you are no longer a passive participant in their game, but an observer who sees the strategy behind the performance. The belief that narcissists act based on internal moral compasses or emotional depth is a common misconception that keeps many people trapped in cycles of pain. In reality, narcissistic individuals operate primarily through a cost-benefit analysis of their environment. They do not naturally experience guilt, nor do they possess a drive to make amends for the sake of integrity. Instead, their decisions are dictated by the acquisition and preservation of narcissistic supply, the attention, validation, or control they require to keep their fragile self-image intact. When you recognize that their internal world is driven by survival of the ego rather than emotional maturity, you begin to understand that they are not motivated by what is right, but by what is effective. Consequently, they only offer an apology when the cost of maintaining their stance becomes too expensive. This is where consequence-based leverage becomes the primary mechanism for change. A narcissist will continue to engage in harmful behaviors without apology as long as the cost to them is low. If they can disregard your feelings without losing access to your support, your time, or your reputation, they have absolutely no incentive to change. However, when you introduce concrete, consistent, and immovable consequences, you change the math of the situation. By establishing boundaries such as ending a conversation the moment they become verbally abusive, or removing yourself from a situation where they attempt to invalidate your experiences, you impose a cost on their behavior. When the price of their disrespect becomes the loss of your presence, your resources, or the convenience you provide, the dynamic shifts. They do not apologize because they suddenly empathize with your struggle. They apologize because they have calculated that losing their connection to you is a greater personal deficit than the minor ego bruise of saying the word sorry. This is not a shift in character, but a shift in their strategic posture. When you stop hoping for a change of heart and start focusing on the enforcement of your boundaries, you stop being a victim of their impulses and start being a manager of the interaction. Once you realize that their apologies are essentially a concession to the new rules you have set, you can stop feeling hurt by the lack of sincerity behind them. You understand the apology as a pragmatic surrender to your boundaries, allowing you to reclaim your personal power and maintain your peace without needing them to be the person you wish they were. Emotional volatility is the primary currency in the ecosystem of a narcissist, serving as the essential fuel for their internal validation. When they provoke you, gaslight you, or engage in boundary-violating behavior, they are actively fishing for a reaction. Whether that reaction is anger, tears, desperate pleading, or defensive explaining, it confirms to them that they still occupy a dominant central space in your psyche. This reaction is what is known as supply. As long as you are providing this emotional output, you are essentially confirming their importance and maintaining a tether that they can pull on whenever they choose. Therefore, the moment you decide to become neutral, that is, the moment you cease to provide the emotional display they crave, you fundamentally disrupt the entire machinery of their interaction with you. By adopting a state of neutrality, you are not simply acting calm, you are becoming an impenetrable surface. When you respond with low energy, objective, and non-emotional communication, you effectively starve them of the supply they need. This can be jarring for them, as they have grown accustomed to the predictable patterns of your reactions. When they can no longer push your buttons to get the feedback they desire, you cease to be a high-value target in their eyes. This shift is incredibly disempowering for them because it forces them to confront a reality where they do not have control over your emotional landscape. They are no longer the director of your moods, and that realization creates a vacuum of power that forces them to reassess their approach to you. Often, when you hold this neutral ground consistently, the narcissist will attempt to escalate their tactics to regain control, but if you remain immovable, they are forced to shift their strategy toward reconciliation. They may offer a performance, an apology, not because they feel anything, but because they are testing to see if their old tools still work. They want to see if a performative "I'm sorry" will trigger the same emotional release from you that they are accustomed to. By remaining detached and neutral, you effectively strip the power from their words. You view their apology as a strategic pivot rather than a genuine transformation, which prevents you from getting pulled back into the drama. When you are neutral, you are no longer playing their game. You have stepped off the board entirely, turning their manipulative tactics into impotent gestures that no longer impact your life or your emotional stability. If you're tired of the cycle of manipulation and you're ready to learn how to keep your peace regardless of what they say or don't say, hit the subscribe button. We are dissecting these patterns every single week so you can stop being a character in their story and start writing your own. Consistency is the most vital, yet most challenging component of setting boundaries with a narcissist. Many people fall into the trap of responding to narcissistic behavior with sporadic, high-intensity demands for accountability. When you are deeply hurt, it is natural to feel a surge of anger and demand an apology, or to attempt to force a confrontation in the heat of the moment. However, for a narcissist, this intensity is merely more supply. They view your desperate desire for an apology as a weakness to be exploited, not as a boundary to be respected. To them, a sudden outburst is just proof that they still have control over your emotions. When you fluctuate between periods of silence, pleading, and angry confrontation, you are sending a message that your boundaries are negotiable and that your peace of mind is entirely dependent on their cooperation. To actually change the dynamic, you must move away from the model of intensity and toward a model of absolute, boring, and immovable consistency. You are not trying to win a debate or convince them of your worth. You are trying to demonstrate that their behavior will always result in a specific, predictable outcome. When a boundary is violated, the response should be calm, immediate, and identical every single time. There is no need for grand speeches or emotional explanations. You simply remove your presence or limit the interaction as you previously defined. If they notice that every time they overstep, they lose access to you, the realization begins to sink in. This is not about scaring them into submission, but about creating an environment where their manipulative tactics simply no longer yield the results they are looking for. Consistency acts as a mirror that reflects the reality of the relationship back to them. By refusing to engage in the chaotic cycles they initiate, you become an immovable object. The narcissist will likely try to test this new consistency, attempting to push harder or pivot to new forms of manipulation to see if your resolve will break. If you yield even once, the cycle resets, and you reinforce the idea that they can eventually wear you down. However, if you remain steadfast, the exhaustion eventually sets in for them. They realize that they can no longer navigate you with their usual bag of tricks. This quiet, persistent firmness is the only language they truly understand, and it is the only way to ensure that your boundaries remain intact. The instinct to explain, justify, and defend your position is a natural human reaction to being wronged. But when dealing with a narcissist, this impulse is the single most effective tool you provide them for manipulation. When you express your feelings or attempt to explain why their behavior was hurtful, you are operating under the false hope that if you just frame the argument logically, they will finally understand your perspective. However, for a narcissist, an explanation is never treated as a bid for mutual understanding. It is treated as a manual for future sabotage. They do not listen to your words to comprehend your pain. They listen for your vulnerabilities, your insecurities, and the specific points that trigger your frustration. Every detail you provide about your inner world is essentially a roadmap they can use to refine their gaslighting and emotional control strategies in the future. This is the essence of the JADE trap. Justifying, arguing, defending, and explaining. When you engage in this cycle, you are handing them the keys to your emotional state. You are validating the premise that their opinion of your experience is what makes it true, and you are inviting them to debate the validity of your own emotions. By shifting the focus of your communication, you move away from the why and how of their actions and toward the consequences. Instead of explaining why you are hurt, you state what you will do in response to a violation. For example, instead of explaining why you feel disrespected by a specific comment, you simply state that you will leave the room if that language continues. This shifts the internal script of the conversation entirely. By refusing to justify your boundaries or argue over your reality, you strip away the fuel the narcissist needs to keep the conflict alive. When you stop jading, you stop trying to convince them of your reality, which is an impossible task because their reality is constructed to protect their ego. You move into a space of radical self-validation. You no longer need them to agree with your assessment of the situation for that assessment to be true. This silence is powerful. It forces them to operate in a vacuum where their usual tactics of distortion and redirection have no leverage. You are no longer providing them with a platform for debate, and in doing so, you protect your energy and reclaim the authority over your own narrative that they have been trying to claim for themselves. The JADE trap, justifying, arguing, defending, and explaining, is the primary mechanism through which you unwittingly surrender your power to a narcissist. When you are mistreated, your natural impulse is to articulate your pain, hoping that if you can just make them understand the depth of their transgression, they will feel remorse. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of the narcissistic architecture. When you justify your feelings, you are inadvertently signaling that your emotions are a matter for debate, rather than a statement of your personal reality. When you argue, you are granting them a platform to gaslight you, pivot the conversation, or turn the tables so that you end up defending your own sanity. Every moment spent trying to convince them of your truth is a moment you spend acknowledging that their validation is required for your experience to be valid. By falling into the jade trap, you provide the narcissist with exactly what they want, a dynamic where they are the judge of your reality and you are the supplicant seeking approval. They do not listen to your explanations to achieve empathy. They listen to identify which of your arguments can be picked apart, which of your insecurities can be poked, and which of your defensive reactions can be used as proof that you are the one who is overreacting. This is how they turn your attempt at healing into an opportunity for further manipulation. You are essentially handing them the tools to dismantle your own perspective, all while clinging to the hope that one day your logic will finally break through their defenses and lead to an apology. The alternative is to move toward the strategy of non-engagement and self-validation. This does not mean you stop standing up for yourself. Rather, it means you stop treating your boundaries as proposals that require their consensus. When you state a boundary, you do not justify why it exists. You do not explain how they hurt you, and you do not argue about whether your reaction is reasonable. You state the boundary as an immovable fact of the interaction. If they test it, you do not defend your reasoning. You simply enact the consequence. By refusing to JADE, you deny them the intellectual fodder they need to keep the drama alive. You reclaim the authority to define your own reality, recognizing that you never needed their permission to feel the way you do or to protect your own well-being. The ultimate goal in navigating a relationship with a narcissist is not to extract a confession or a performative apology, but to reach a state of internal detachment where your worth is no longer tied to their behavior. Many people remain tethered to the narcissist for years, caught in a repetitive cycle of disappointment because they believe that an apology is the essential key to their closure. This mindset creates a dangerous dependency, placing your emotional health in the hands of someone who is fundamentally incapable of prioritizing your feelings or acknowledging their own faults. By making your healing contingent upon their admission of guilt, you essentially hand over the keys to your happiness, allowing them to remain the architect of your emotional state long after they have stopped being a positive presence in your life. True detachment is the process of realizing that you do not need their validation to confirm that your experiences were real, your pain was valid, and your boundaries were necessary. When you stop chasing the apology, you stop being a prisoner of their narrative. You cease to be a person who is constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop, or holding your breath until they decide to offer a crumb of recognition. This does not mean that you forgive or forget the harm that was done. Rather, it means that you have neutralized the power they have over your present and future. You reach a point of profound self-assurance where their refusal to apologize no longer stings because you no longer require them to be an honest, empathetic, or healthy person for you to be at peace with yourself. When you achieve this level of detachment, the entire dynamic of the interaction changes. You become less of a target because you have removed the emotional hooks they use to manipulate you. The game they played, that of shifting blame, gaslighting, and withholding, becomes obsolete because there is no longer a player on the other side who is trying to win. You begin to define your own reality based on your standards, values, and experiences, rather than the distorted mirror they tried to force upon you. By releasing the desperate need for their accountability, you reclaim your agency. You finally understand that the only apology you ever truly needed was the one you gave to yourself when you finally decided to prioritize your own well-being over their approval, marking the end of their influence and the beginning of your recovery. The path to reclaiming your peace does not lie in breaking down the narcissist's defenses to extract an apology. It lies in dismantling the illusion that their validation has any bearing on your reality. We started by acknowledging the futility of waiting for remorse from those incapable of feeling it, and we moved through the strategy of using consequences as leverage, maintaining absolute neutrality, and refusing to engage in the exhausting trap of justification. You must understand that any apology you eventually receive is merely a calculated pivot in their strategy, not a transformation of their character. By detaching your emotional well-being from their behavior, you cease to be a pawn in their game and become the sole authority over your own life. Stop waiting for them to tell you that you were right because you already know you are. True victory isn't getting them to say sorry. It is reaching the point where, regardless of what they say, their words no longer have the power to define your worth, affect your emotions, or disrupt your peace. You have the power to close this chapter not because they admitted their mistakes, but because you finally realized that their narrative never mattered as much as your own healing.